Hello. Hey, you guys. Welcome back. I've just filmed 10 minutes of content explaining what a quirky British female was, only to realise that my mic wasn't turned on and that there was no sound because it was dependent on picking up the mic. So, yeah, that's really annoying, isn't it? But that sums up this week. It's been a week of chaos. It's been a week of ridiculousness. It's been a week of just general randomness. Ha! Anyway, so quirky British female. What do I mean by this? Well, quirky British females, there are many of us. I'm not the only one out there, but I chose to find my channel by naming it Quirky British Female because I think it's certainly going to resonate with a very particular type of audience. Think Dawn French, think Fleabag, think Kate Bush, think any woman that is just a little bit slightly tapped, think Jamila Jamal, think just people who are a little, FK Twigs. We're just these women that are British or have grown up in Britain and just have a very creative, very distinctive, very particular outlook on life, and something about us that quintessentially makes us quirky and British. So I wouldn't use the word odd or weird, but there's certainly aspects of it. I mean, think of Helena Bonham Carter. She's probably our archetype here. She's just very distinctly herself. She's very unique and she's very naturally her most authentic version of her. And I think that's what we're talking about here. There's no pretense. There's no facade. Think about Bridget Jones. If you've ever watched Bridget Jones's Diary, that sort of quirkiness to her. She's strong, she's assertive, but then sometimes she's a bit self-deprecating. She has a little bit of low self-esteem, but she certainly rallies and is able to champion herself and fight her own corner. So there's lots of things that make these people distinctively quirky British females. So I'm going to talk about what I mean by this because I think it's kind of an interesting topic. You too might identify as a quirky British female. You might not. You might be a quirky British male. You might be a quirky British non-binary person because you don't want to be defined by gender, and that's absolutely okay. Everyone is welcome here. You might be an eccentric French person. You might actually be a kooky American. I think you kind of get the sort of type that we're referring to here, but obviously I thought that maybe we'd go into a little deep dive and explain a little bit more about what in particular makes somebody a quirky British female and what these attributes and what these qualities are. So let's get started. So I've got a little bit of a definition to share with you. So I'm going to read from it because it wasn't one that I could actually memorize here. So the quirky British woman is more than just eccentric. So I've already explained that she's often a contradiction, self-deprecating yet fierce, chaotic yet sharp, unconventional, but deeply rooted in identity or place. So a quirky British woman is someone who defies norm with flair, wit, and individuality. So this real sense of being their own person and being pretty comfortable and confident in who they are. Often expressing herself in unexpected, humorous, or creatively bold ways. So again, these people might be authors or actresses or artists or writers, or do something that requires them to give a sense of their self and their personality through whatever it is they do. She might be a performer, a writer, a public figure, artist, politician, but what links her to this identity is her ability to surprise, charm, or provoke while being unapologetically herself. I mean, even that little definition there makes me think that we could be referring to Anne Widdecombe here, if you know who she is. Okay, so what are the kind of characteristics here that we're talking about? What are the actual little archetypical things that we would expect in our quirky British female? So eccentricity with purpose. So again, think of Tracy Emin's messy beds if you're familiar with the art world. Think about Helena Bonham Carter's wardrobe. It's very much reflective of her and it's very quirky and distinctive and unique to her. So they're not really weird for weird's sake. They channel a quirk that's artistic, political, humorous, or even something that defines their performance aspect. But they're very much with a sense of eccentricity, a little bit of obscurely odd or not within the realms of the average or typical or everyday. And again, that's what's appealing, isn't it? Somebody who's okay and comfortable to be their own particular self. And we absolutely love that. Another thing that I think is a key criteria of being a typically British female that's quirky is dry humour and self-deprecation. They don't really take themselves too seriously and are quite happy to have a laugh at their own expense, which actually makes people feel quite comfortable in their presence. They're not thinking they're the big I am, even though some of these women can be really huge celebrities or, heroines in their field or political activists. They're not afraid to just sort of take a little moment to laugh at themselves or to be modest or to realize that they're just regular women trying to do the best that they can with the skill set that they have. So British wit is essential to this, and British wit is very particular, isn't it? If you've ever seen anything like Fawlty Towers, Mr. Bean, I know that's very globally known. Dawn French, Jennifer Saunders, Victoria Wood, brilliant example of a quirky British female there. There's just that type of humour, and I don't think you typically get it across the rest of the world. I mean, every culture has its own humour and its own jokes, and therefore those little cultural nuances that make it very distinctive to them. But British humour is very dry, I think, and we have this wit about us that not other people get sometimes. I certainly know that when I'm cracking a few jokes, that it's sort of landed in a confusing way on people that aren't or aren't familiar with British culture. That sarcasm, if you've watched Fleabag, you get it. We love that. It can be awkward or mischievously blunt that kind of makes somebody think or reflect on themselves. Or sometimes it just completely goes over people's heads and they're just sat there going, what was that about? Miriam Margolyes is a brilliant example. She's phenomenal. If you've ever seen her on TV shows like Graham Norton, she's just so dry and so her humour is just so deadpan. It's just absolutely amazing. And Phoebe Waller-Bridge, as I've mentioned, the Fleabag character, absolutely that dry humour and self-deprecation was very much part of that. Even the TV series Motherland, I think, certainly brings out that quirky British females and the different archetypes within that of the roles of mothers, is very, very humorous and very specific to a British kind of cultural palette. So these women can also be quite stylish, can't they? Let's go back to Helena Bonham Carter and that kind of flamboyant fashion sense that she has. Think Zadie Smith, FK Twigs, Paloma Faith. They're kind of women that have their own distinctive style and bring that through their performance, their art, their music. And they're not afraid to be those bold, empowered women. They use retro aesthetics, maybe. Get some women that are very much wanting to dress in maybe a 1960s kind of vibe, even though they're living in contemporary British society. Maybe there's a mismatched on purpose, clashing prints, odd colours, not afraid to take those bold risks. They're not following fashion because it's in fashion. They're just doing something because it brings them pure joy and pure pleasure because they're wearing them. In fact, I follow a lady on Instagram who's brilliant at this. Her name's Adeline, I believe, and she just wears things that bring her joy, makes her happy. She has pink hair, and there's a playfulness and a very, again, quirky Britishness to what she does. I will put a link to her Instagram down below because I definitely think she's worth checking out. And style becomes part of the performance. They're very particular in how they appear and their aesthetic that they present through their artwork, their music, their acting, whatever particular genre of performance that they choose to do. So they're also quite unfiltered, and sometimes they can be a little bit provocative. So they're trying to provoke reactions. They're trying to make you think. They're trying to make you question. Sometimes they speak plainly and they can speak politically. I love Jamila Jamal for this. I think she really raises some brilliant points. I know that she spends a lot of time in the USA and has sort of been immersed in an American culture, but she will stand up for things, and she really has some insightful, perspectives on like women's weight, politics in America, the male loneliness crisis, things like this. She will give her spin on it, but she's not trying to be anything other than her genuine self and put across her perspective from her kind of, her view of the situation, and she's not afraid to be impolite. She's not afraid to just say how it is. And I think that's important. Again, Jo Brand is a female comedian that does this as well. She'll tell you how it is. Michaela Coel, as I've said, the TV series I May Destroy You, you know, some harsh topics raised in that, but she was happy to go there and to share her view and her story. And I think that was really important. So absolutely, sometimes these political messages can come through and they're not afraid to share those views or make it a little bit awkward, because sometimes being a little bit awkward is a little bit of a British thing and we love that, don't we? So I think we can also go into this as intellectual. I think there's a degree of intelligence with a quirky British woman. They're well read. They might follow the news. They might be politically motivated. They might be interested in world politics. They might take an interest in something and stand up for it. They're not going to sit on the sidelines. They're going to share their voice. They're not going to be afraid to voice what they think. And they'll have the information behind it. They're not just echoing other people. They're literally putting across why they think what they think and might be willing to challenge and argue about this. But there's also that quirky oddballness that is obviously that comes across here. They'll also be quite literate. So they will be academically sharp, maybe philosophically reflective. I don't think they're going to be obstinate in their views. I think they're going to be willing to learn and be educated, but they certainly know their stance on something when they have the information. And they will often try and challenge societal norms. I think this is really important. You know, it's relevant to try and express ourselves and feel comfortable in sharing our views in not a way to be offensive, but in a way of educating and being progressive and improving things. So there's disruptors of convention as well. They're not going to be typically conventional. So they might not be defined by their gender roles and that they're typically feminine or delicate or demure. They might not be typical in their fashion. They might be a little bit rogue and go over, you know, a different particular, you know, idea of what fashion is. And this isn't a class thing. You can be any class and be a quirky British female. And obviously class is a big part of Britishness. We have, like, you know, our working class or middle class or upper middle class or aristocracy. Class used to be a very definitive aspect of British society. However, I feel like we're moving away from that, and those cultural identities of being defined in a particular way because of your class doesn't mean that you're working class and uneducated, doesn't mean that you're not literate or capable. Actually just means that your lived experience of your class and your background maybe influences the way that you think about certain topics. And they will challenge things and they will stand up for what they believe in. So the contextualness to Britishness, because you obviously have to have spent a proportion of time living in Britain. And this Britishness can come from moving here. This Britishness can be from being born here, but you will certainly have grown up and spent a considerable amount of time within Britain and therefore understand its structure, its humour, its societal expectations and norms. Again, I've just talked about class consciousness as part of this, isn't it? There is a knowledge that not everybody belongs in the same class. And there's sometimes some procedures and prestige that go with particular class, you know, identities. If you're in the aristocracy and you're going to be hanging out with royalty, that's certainly going to be very different than if you're going down the local pub for a few pints on a Friday night. And this sometimes leads into parody of class identity. We're not afraid to mock our working class roots or our very posh roots, you know, and I think that's okay. We don't mind. Like, we're so typically middle class, ha ha ha. You know, we all like to buy our stuff from John Lewis, ha 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 ha. Doesn't that make us boring? Ha 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 ha. And you know, whether posh, working class, or maybe you are, you know, socially ambiguous. Maybe, you know, what class do I belong to? That's none of your business. I'm just going to be an observer of this sort of Britishness and bring my own spin to it. Regionality. So obviously you can hear where a British person is from their accent. You can even probably glean what class they are from their accent, which is pretty cool, isn't it? We've got a lot of accents, you know. I think Brummie is a very distinctive one. If you've watched Peaky Blinders, maybe if you've watched Downton Abbey, you're very familiar with that RP, received pronunciation, or the Queen's English. maybe you're a bit, a Cheryl Tweedy fan or Cheryl Cole, and that way are you Geordie. Maybe you're a bit Welsh. I'm not going to do a Welsh accent. I don't want to offend anybody. Maybe you're from the valleys. Having watched a bit of Gavin and Stacey, maybe you're Scottish and you're really familiar with Edinburgh and how different it is to a Glaswegian accent, maybe from Northern Ireland and that Belfast accent. But we're very geographically varied, and we're also very geographically diverse, considering a very small island in the middle of the kind of near Atlantic on the coast of Europe. So from this is obviously, this sense of where we've come from, our local pride. We don't forget where we come from. I'm from somewhere near Stoke-on-Trent, so, I'm very proud of the potteries. But I can also mimic it and take the pee out of it, because quite frankly, some of it is absolutely farcical. Oat cakes, they're amazing, aren't they? And Scouse people, look how proud they are. Got that Liverpool birds going around with their rollers in their hair, their tracksuits, and the Scouse brow. Again, this identity linked to our regionality. I don't even think regionality is a word, but let's make it one. To the region that we grew up in is obviously another key aspect of it, and part of that quirky Britishness that we're talking about. And that resistance to perfection. I think I've already mentioned that. Messy is good. Being too perfect or too slick makes you almost disingenuous or lacking in authenticity or not relatable in some way. People like the flaws. People are warmed by flaws. People don't mind if you're not a perfect person. And authenticity wins over polish every day, or at least that's what I think. You can comment below if you have a different perspective. So, how can we embody a little bit of that quirky British ideology into our own lives? Well, first of all, self deprecation as armour. There's nothing wrong with having a little laugh or a joke about yourself. Emma Thompson describes herself as a walking crumple. I'm not entirely sure what she means by that, but she's a very educated, very attractive, very accomplished woman, but she's still not afraid to have a little crack of a joke at herself or her own expense. So, she's, British women will often undermine their own glamour or authority in order to make people around them feel more comfortable or feel approachable or be able to develop the discussion further. There's an approachability and charm. And if we can have a little laugh at ourselves, people are going to laugh along with us, not at us. And they're going to be in on the joke and they're going to be made to feel included. So I think that's a really important aspect of it. Again, I've talked about this, but the celebration of the eccentric. It doesn't have to be this kind of palatable, standard version of femininity. It can be a little bit quirky. It can be a little bit different. British culture historically celebrates oddballs. In fact, a lot of our British comedy talks about British oddballs. Some mothers do have them. Anyone watch those? We've got aristocratic weirdos and quirky, historical figures, haven't we? To working class comedians. And I just think there's so much variety in this, and we love a little bit of lovable looniness. We don't mind that. I mean, sometimes I think people have coined in on that and used that to their own advantage, but I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with it. We don't mind a little bit of class satire. We don't mind, making fun of the different class systems. We don't mind poking a bit of fun at some of our own habits. That Jet2 advert that's gone global or viral this year, it's definitely been seen in some very comedic situations. And I think, again, it's that British humour when you've got there's some of the tropes and the ways that I've seen it pan out on social media has actually been quite funny. They exaggerate their poshness maybe. So I know that Helena Bonham Carter can do that. There was that thing about tea time that's been going on the internet as well, that we have to stop and have a cup of tea. That's an example of that British quirkiness. Or that regional identity. I'm going back to Victoria Wood here. She was just brilliant at that, wasn't she? And if you're not familiar with Victoria Wood, I recommend that you maybe have a look at some videos on here and have a look at a very particular, very quirky sense of humour. And the nuance is harder to find elsewhere, where politics, I think in parts of the world now, everything's become very polarized and very oppositional. And I think that when we're willing to make those little satirical jokes about ourselves or be a bit subversive with our viewpoints and our humor, I think it just makes things a lot more tolerable or palatable or easier to accept. And as I've said, we're anti-slick, anti-perfection. It doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be perfect. We don't mind people just saying something stupid and having a little bit of laugh about it. Quirky British women often prefer flaws, mess, and chaos. And I've talked to you, there's a lot of chaos energy around here. There's a lot of messiness around here. So obviously that's certainly within the archetype. And think of Fleabag when she breaks that fourth wall, her whiskey drinking messiness. And she's a very stylized character, but then some of the stuff that she gets into can be pretty messy and pretty humorous. So, yeah, the quirky British female is very much based on the environment that she's found herself being raised in, and those class politics, that lack of perfection, that sometimes putting her foot in the mouth, not being polished, making faux pas, but also being politically motivated, educated, or global, or having viewpoints and perspectives and being interested in things and willing to stand up and have a voice. So all those are things. Well, obviously we can find different types of these women. There are women like this in America. There are women like this in France. There are women like this in Japan. There are women like this in Nigeria. We are going to find these very strong, particularly, women in these places. However, it's those distinctively British qualities that are going to make them different. So you might have, a manic pixie kind of American, that kooky sort of new girl, Zoe Deschanel, I think would probably be like the American version of that to some extent. She really does have that sort of cute quirkiness. In France, they're kind of philosophical, but they'll probably be a bit more stylish. They'll probably be a bit naturally more polished, but they'll also be a little bit more revolutionary. I think French women are very motivated to express themselves, and I think there's a coolness to French eccentricity. That kind of, it's very different depending on where the culture, the person is raised in. So let's have a little list of some people that might be our quirky British female. So I've mentioned Helena Bonham Carter. I've mentioned Kate Bush. So they're iconic for, their eccentricities, their, song lyrics, their performances, their fashion. I mean, to some extent, Kate Bush and her reclusiveness. Phoebe Waller-Bridge, that dry humour, that self-deprecating, she's boundary pushing. Miriam Margolyes, outspoken, wildly funny, and sometimes really unexpected. There's been some humorous, smutty stuff that's come from her that has really taken me out of left field. Olivia Colman, I mean, she is a quirky British woman, and she's so versatile and looks so different. And again, some of the performances that she's delivered have been truly inspirational. Lily Allen, she's quite outspoken. She's willing to be her best self. Annie Lennox, I mean, when she first came on the music scene back in the day, absolutely pushing those boundaries. A quirky Scottish woman, if ever I'd seen one. Paloma Faith, her unique style. She's not afraid of, being candid and honest. She can be very theatrical in her performances as well. I've kind of talked about Victoria Wood. I've talked about Dawn French. I've talked about Jennifer Saunders, Jo Brand. So there's a lot of these women who are comedians, which is obviously absolutely amazing. Right, so I'm going to wrap it up there because I think I've listed quite a significant number of British females who are quirky. If you can think of any quirky British females, please feel free to comment below and let me know what you think on this. Are you a quirky British female? Do you know any? Do you think that this is completely ridiculous archetype? Do you have a different perspective on this? Please feel free to share your ideas below. It's been a pleasure as always, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.